Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Scandinavian armies organizations, more specifically, in the time frame of 11th to 13th century, 1300, and we essentially trace the history of a phenomenon that we have already observed in other videos about the Viking era, that and beyond, right? We have dealt in more than one video with Scandinavian history, this broader high medieval times, without tracing a pretty sharp separation between the Viking era and what came later. Albeit important changes did occur, but the phenomenon was much more gradual in a way. We're talking, of course, about the first of all, the end of the Viking era proper, or at least the resizing of the aims and the spaces of action of the Scandinavian expeditions outside of their boundaries, because other powers around had fundamentally consolidated their strength and were now capable of essentially repelling the raids, the invasions, and also the establishment, more importantly, the establishment of we can't start using the adjective national monarchies, right? Because this is the point at which, essentially from the 11th century onwards, we see more clearly the emergence of Denmark, Sweden, Norway as three distinct kingdoms. In fact, the three distinct monarchies that naturally took a long time to assume as a satisfactory degree of centralization compared at least to the Western European ones, and that naturally are the altogether as a broader transformation, part of many important changes in politics and society that we now observe through the military point of view. So this is a standard video about armies organizations that we make every once in a while. Last week we actually made one video about the Viking armies organization. So this is in many ways the prosecution of it, right? And it's the story also, the establishment of chivalry, right? Of a knightly class, we could say, in parallel to the Scandinavian monarchy. And however, also about, and it's a story about the permanence of sometimes in an unvaried way, really, of the previous centuries in an actually wildly ranging set of social, political forms of organization, because fundamentally what the extremes we swing between today are, fundamentally a feudal monarchy with with the same, more or less the same Western European standards for the Kingdom of Denmark, to literally hunter-gathering societies out the outskirts of the northeast of Scandinavia, and with the neighboring think about the Lapps, the Finns, etc., and even North America, for example, and naturally very diverse landscapes, and in fact neighboring peoples at this point, because these changes were triggered in part, as you understand it, as we have seen in other circumstances, largely by phenomena that were mainly, in fact, political and social as always, but that were pioneered, for example, in parallel to the Christianization of Scandinavia, the establishment of a proper territorial administration, thanks to the foundation of local churches, and the alliance in this sense of the church with the monarchy. We will see how important actually the ecclesiastical knights were in Scandinavia. Similarly to, probably even more to other areas of Europe, in relative terms at least, and naturally from the other side, this natural, I could say even resistance, but simply unmodified picture of many communities that kept living fundamentally in the same old tribal fashion, and really the picture didn't change enormously much in the highly conservative Scandinavian kingdoms proper, right? What the deal is here is that naturally all these communities were used to live in, tribally speaking, under an oligarchy, or sometimes was really quite modest on its own. Scandinavia had a very low social stratification. It was in many ways an underdeveloped region in Europe, and therefore even the nobility at a local level was often, just modest landowners after all, that gradually were also framed within the monarchic clienteles. They emerge as barons, etc. There is a rise naturally and an increase of the social status of this individual over time, alongside with the social stratification proper. But for the rest, lots of other communities, seeing especially in the least developed areas. Think about the Finnish coast, that at this point is by the 13th century fundamentally under the control of the Swedish monarchy, will remain literally up to the modern age, and a society ruled by very modest farmers, right, landholders. And this is fascinating because naturally it makes you understand the difficulties that existed in the emergence of a state pool, right? This made three major areas of Scandinavia, like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, all, for reasons that are somewhat evident, distinguished themselves over time. There were also different different contacts, different, at some point the interaction between Sweden and Norway, for example, was greater. Eventually Norway, was more in contact with Denmark in many ways, and more in general, it was the stability of these powers that was fundamentally low over time. Part of the reason even why, for example, the Hanseatic League could expand so much is part of the weakness of the northern monarchies, the failure of the centralization of the German monarchy in the south. At the same time, there is a great share of models, of political, institutional, military models, right? And what the Scandinavian nobility and monarchy understands here is that by importing the models of essentially of Frankish derivation, they can structure better their power at a territorial level. Like the resources are scanning, especially after the end of the Viking era. Fundamentally, all the all the loot that was taken from this kind of imperialistic. Think about Knut the Great at the beginning of the 11th century. Was a maritime empire in many ways that exacted important resources, many of which were actually burnt. Right, there wasn't much of a along the way. I mean, to maintain the same empire, but in part had contributed to form, in fact, especially in Denmark, some more imposing structures. So, like Denmark was better off already, but by itself, it had more resources. Also, the terrain somewhat helped the construction of greater dominations. They had built impressive fortifications to the southern border with the counts of Holstein, the Danevirke, right? Over time it had been improving, and it was naturally closer to civilization. It was more sensible to the German models, because that's fundamentally where they arrived from in Scandinavia. While other realities, especially Norway, had different stories. Sweden is relatively underdocumented, at least compared to the others, and we know that even in there, by the 13th century, it was fundamentally a monarchy. Probably it was achieved less by others, not much because it was necessarily less resourceful than than Norway, but it also had a very peculiar structure. Think about even just how these communities were compressed between the mountains and the sea. So there were interesting developments there that were, even just militarily speaking, seems, for example, the longbow was more important in Norway than in other areas, whereas cavalry was naturally more of a thing in Denmark, that had already originally even better breeds. That Scandinavia didn't have such great breeds for cavalry. They were usually smaller. The shock tactics that were pioneered by the Western Franks were imported there with more difficulty for this very reason. But for example, Sweden was but a bit like all the whole Scandinavia, but naturally compared to the others, more exposed to the steppes culture. Actually, we find a great evidence throughout all, even the Viking era, even the previous centuries, of the importance of cavalry proper, and models that are typically steppes-like and that flourish. And over time, it developed. Cavalry, even the Viking era, was actually quite important, and it remains as a model kingship and naturally of nobility. That, however, is not so structurally rooted, right? Just in terms of sheer quantitative availability. as a system, right, as in continental Europe. And this naturally will influence the local traditions, but, there is more evidence, for example, lamellar armor in Sweden, compared to, even maybe a greater exposure to horse archery from the east. We find surely a heavier character of the Danish armies, right, alongside with a greater wealth, capability of equipping troops with better armor in general. We find also weapons like the famous Danish axe that is almost stereotypically attached to the figure of the Viking warrior. That seemingly actually stemmed from somewhere else, like that. Just like the Francisco wasn't back in the migration era much of a Germanic thing, but of a Roman one that eventually was passed to the Germanic peoples. So naturally, there is a history of many exposures of Scandinavia. It was this important part of a major highway that connected the especially during the Viking era, the Northern Europe at least, to the markets of Central Asia, right? And we find that this intense contacts and definitely development tied to these dynamics. Now, the problem is that by the 11th century, the Viking expeditions fundamentally are reduced drastically. The Scandinavians take part to the crusades in the Near East, as in the Baltic eventually, especially Denmark, to respond to the Wendish piracy. But they're naturally much more limited expeditions, much more modest expeditions than they had been before. So this meant that all the resources that were drawn from other countries through the systematic looting were not available anymore. And this forces the local monarchies, the incipient Scandinavian monarchies, to search for a more substantial formula of centralization on a local base, local resources, that naturally triggers conflicts, because the local communities do not like this idea very much. In some ways, it was also useful for them, but there was space in this sense to co-opt the local oligarchy. Let's put it in this way. And there is even a reduction in the sheer size of the armies, right? Rarely at this point we see armies that surpass, 4,000. The sagas, I think, do not speak of more ever than 8,000. And the typical Scandinavian contingent here was of something like 500. And the interesting thing about this is that infantry in Scandinavia also maintained, in parallel with the greater difficulties of the rise of the knightly class, a greater importance, right? And even the development of certain weapons that are more stereotypically attached to Scandinavia, like these long-shafted axes and other, infantry weapons, were mainly, at least, surely, double hands swords and and axes are not particularly well suited for mounted combat. You can use them, but there is some way better you can do on horseback with other weapons, and that's surely not the best option in general. Maintain a concrete role, right, that fundamentally limits even the rise of cavalry as it was being structured in a feudal sense, right? But indeed, in Scandinavia, we have seen also in previous videos how the late Viking era had already produced the rise of the monarchies after all, and certain systems of recruitment and of military organization that entailed an important amount of professionalism at a certain political and social levels. We will see it with the herd fundamental and the kingly retinues, and also with the very gradual detachment of the local communities from the more regular military activity. Right, this happens simply for different reasons. Scandinavia gradually grows richer, and people have better things to think than about war in terms of sheer local productivity. But naturally, these societies need also more effective protectors from the above, and the monarchy fundamentally plays that role. There is the rise of castles at this point. There is a territorial domination that extends at that point in ways that also the smaller landowners can't compete much with anymore. So there are phenomena like, the monetization of the military service, right? And by the way, today we will not talk about the Leidang, because we made a specific video about it, right? And you know what the Leidang was, this massive ship levy that was, functionally developed in Scandinavia since we don't really know when the sense from. This probably what existed since the ancient times, but naturally had received a great boost during the Viking era, where more people were, joining just because they would receive part of the loot. So at least with that expectation, now as we've seen, that motivating force has decreased. So there have to be different ways to levy the troops, and in fact, monetization has to do with that. And there is a video about the Leidang exactly in this centuries 11th to 13th. So if you want to, there is a medieval Scandinavia playlist where you can look at that. Otherwise, we talked about it also towards the end of the more recent Viking armies organization video, and naturally we will make other videos talking specifically about, Viking ships or certain particular types of troops. These are kind of general introductory videos about the military organization of this European regions per se, right? And then eventually we will descend into the details. So we will speak today essentially of terrestrial forces, and we will partially split this between Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, right? And we are better documented for Norway at a certain level, at least ideally, relatively to the local military organization and the organic composition of the armies. And starting, in fact, from Norway, right? In this centuries, like in earlier times, we start with these paid troops of bodyguards, right? That essentially remains rather than developing a feudal elite. This is kind of characteristic of Norway that naturally undergoes basically the same dynamic over time, and the same here evolved conceptually, essentially, into the feudal system, right? It's just that certain countries basically dwell more into it. Here it was ideally or conceptually at least based on the tribal comitatus model, right? It was almost a clanic at the beginning, military form of organization based on kingship, on the system of gifts that we have seen. Also recently we made another video about the new phase of the miles of the knight that was referred mainly to the continental developments, but that even in this same century, at the end of the Viking era, was taking place in Scandinavia in the very exact sense. The idea of essentially creating a retinue of, at this point, of truly professional troops, in the sense that they live fundamentally for a military, with a military lifestyle, right? And you think just about the violence of this world in this broader political instability, that there was always valid motivation to fight and to profit from it. So naturally, much of the effectiveness of this here was based on the naturally not just on the skill and the experience of these troops, but also on their ability to, for example, be adequately armed, equipped by the king in this sense, or it could be an oligarch, a nobleman, right? So they were naturally, let's say, in this sense, public, but mostly, let's say, better royal herds, and then the private ones, and it was in many ways the same real concept from which feudalism itself emerged, right? But it didn't entail necessarily the territorialization of these troops. The beneficium, the idea that it was an exchange of a military service to be performed in exchange of a land grant, right, of a stabilization of the here somewhere else, right? This will actually increase during the 11th and 13th century, right? So much that it will transform in that, but this structure, at least in Norway, it will be relatively weak. We will see how the herd will decline in importance exactly in the moment in which it was territorialized and sent as far as Iceland in certain circumstances. Whereas in other countries, the feudalism at that point, the herd system, was probably in its full maturity, was introduced later and disappeared earlier. Just like in Denmark, it instead sees the earliest actually in Scandinavia, and more consistent rise of the feudal system and of the knightly class as such, right? And the herd itself transformed organically in Norway. By the end of the 11th century, comprised, for example, next to the herdmen proper, right? That were conceptually the professional troops in this regard. The jester, that were the so-called guests, the candle swains, the trencher swains, and the huskarls. So they all fought alongside the true herdmen in this sense. And in fact, even the terminology is tricky, because all these different troops were actually considered by this time herdmen in the more general sense of the word, so that they were part of the herd, technically speaking. And this segmentation actually reflects in part the increase in importance of the herdman himself, that at this point requires retainers, is ever more increasingly mounted and better equipped. So these troops were did maintain actually an identity on their own, but still functionalized in making this herd working now as something bigger than it had been before. That it had begun just like a band of thugs went around raiding and looting and all this stuff. And naturally, you already see an important transformation, right? And the herdmen were usually, albeit not always, volunteers, right? And could even include foreigners. We'll see how basically in Scandinavia, like in many other parts of non-Frankish Europe, it would be mostly, in fact, these Western mercenaries that were essentially allowed to settle in and to import their, even their culture, their technical skills, etc., and to form, sometimes even artificially in this sense, a feudal class, right? That as a foreign element would be more unavoidably tied to the king, and to contrast the rest of the nobility. We've seen it in Hungary, for example. In Scandinavia, most of these knights came from Germany. That naturally was the closest Western, let's call it Frankish, rather, country in this regard. I mean, Frankish naturally in terms of the vassalitic beneficiary political and social form of organization. But even in Germany, the Eastern Frankish kingdom wasn't this great much compared to Western Frank, in the sense that the true feudalism actually is imported by Frederick Barbarossa in the second half of the 12th century in Germany, whereas before, even the difference with Scandinavia was not enormous, right? It was substantial, but not enormous, but was still definitely enough for triggering some change in Scandinavia itself through this influence. And of all the herd categories mentioned above, the herdmen were the elite, as we have seen, right? They were properly the ones who had a more markedly military and professional character, right? They followed the king wherever he went, in peace and war alike, and never left the court except by special permission. So this retinue was naturally the best form of the best unit you basically could find out there in Scandinavia, and they were naturally employed not just for representatives, but naturally to extend manu militari, the royal power over the kingdom. They were unavoidably faithful and dependent on their lord that provided them with, as we have seen before, the equipment and also the loot. With not properly the pay, because a minimal monetization starts over time in Scandinavia to take place. Next in rank came the jester, that, as we have seen in the video on the Viking military organization, were established in the early part of the 11th century. Right, they were originally essentially landowners that were were co-opted also by the local lords to manage things like the recruitment, originally even to organize military expeditions on their own, right? And they were acquiring now a proper status and that consisted at this point in a general reputation that they had, and they were also valued seemingly because of their contacts, their nets as spies and assassins. Even sometimes they received half as much pay as herdmen, right? Then the candle swains, the XI-XIII, right, were paid at the same rate as, but were of lower rank than the jester, right, and were apparently first introduced in Norway by Olaf III, known as the Quiet, 1066-1093. And as their name suggests, they were torchbearers, right? But they were liable to guard duties as well. Then there were the trencher swains, the Skutilsveinar, also probably introduced by Olaf III, served at the table, right, as well as performing guard duties. Now, naturally, these, kind of domestic roles were, kind of a, we could call it a palace office in using a big word. I mean, technically they did exactly this, but this means that they were trustees of the lord. They were people that helped, generally speaking, in the management of the household, of the properties, who knew how to use arms, right? They were properly fighters themselves, but not as much as the core, the hardcore of the herdman proper. And in fact, the Skutilsveinar seem to have performed the functions of junior officers on the field. Lastly, there were the huskarls, right? So the men of the house, literally. So people who lived in the household. And during the Viking Age, these had been the king's guardsmen, right? Or at least these had been called as huskarls. But by the 13th century, we are in a very advanced stage of transformation. They constituted the lowest herd element of all, right? Performing essentially largely manual duties, right? But having still kind of a military function. And each of these distinct elements of the herd had its own commander and ships, right? So technically they were a broader unit, right? They had their own esprit de corps, their own fealty to the lord or to the king, whomever they belonged to. And the most senior herdmen of all were these important figures of the Merkismand. There was the marksman who carried the king's standard. Right? We've seen it also in the previous video. There was a lot of, naturally, of deep and mystical symbolism attached to the standards, to the banners that all had properly a magical value, and they were considered to contain same supernatural force or Odin or other spiritual entities. The crow was a very prominent symbol. Think about Harald or Hardrada having it in 1066 on its own. So literally they were also just a way to be recognized more practically. Then there was the Stallari or Staller, right, of whom there was sometimes more than one, and in Sweden and in Denmark he would be replaced by the Marshal alongside the more the Western influence. And the Staller usually commanded a division of the army on the battlefield or one of the king's principal ships at sea. Right? And consider, as we were saying before, that there wasn't a fracture between the Viking era and this time, so that actually maritime expeditions would be more prominent, especially in the Baltic at that point. And the last invasion of Britain actually was by 1075, if I'm not wrong, 9 years after the defeat and death of Harald Hardrada. But this system now was acting inwards, right? And trying at that point to construct not much of a predatory outwards projected system, but rather an inwards one that could start to consolidate better the monarchical structures for the sake of government, and so on. And we have a traditional, also apparently constitutional proportion of the king's hird composition in Norway, right? And this had to number allegedly 120 men, which is the, as we have recalled in the last video, the Scandinavian long 100, right? You know, that counted in fact not 100 but 120, comprising a half of hirdmen, so 60, plus 30 jester and 30 huskarls. This segmentation is very interesting because it shows at the end of the Viking era how fundamentally this relation, one hirdman per either a jester or a huskarl, I mean, doesn't it resemble like one knight, one squire in a way, right? This is still like, it seems like the bulk, especially the sub-segmentation of jester and huskarls, maybe messes the thing up slightly, but you know, this 60 hirdmen are definitely a bulkier force than, let's say, the elitistic feudal knight with the retinue in turn. But it's still resembling the, you know, the older tribal, you know, asset they already saw during Viking era, you know, attendance for this elite warriors indeed. But this is gradually shifting towards a higher degree of you know, stratification within a segmentation. And Olaf III of Norway is credited for having doubled the hird organic to in fact 200 men, albeit this is a figure that represents just the hird was present at court, right? And it also excluded probably the candle and trench swains, right? So naturally there was a different composition of the units that served wherever the king was ruling from, and as we've seen, they moved alongside with him, and others were sent were posted throughout the kingdom, right? Were hirdmen themselves, right? And in this case of Norway, sometimes as far as Iceland, right? And in fact, it was the steady increase in number of such absentee hirdmen, especially under King Sverre, 1184-1202, that led to the decline in the character and standard of the Norwegian hird by the 13th century, right? And even to the point at which, in the early 14th century, some refused to perform military service. And the point here is, as we were saying before, that it seems like this hird system was essentially growing anachronistic in time, right? In other countries, as we'll see now, especially in Denmark, actually had evolved into, had actually been surpassed and replaced by the feudal system, a quasi-feudal system, at least we can say. The Norwegians were more conservative and tried probably to expand the system to keep all these lands that the crown, namely, you know, possessed, but you know, that were more difficult to control. And therefore what really happened also in areas that were decentralized, but especially they weren't extremely productive on their own, so that couldn't fuel the rise of powerful aristocracy in a local base, differently from what was happening in the rest of feudal Europe, essentially diluted with the rest of the population, at the point that instead of maintaining the status of hirdmen, they simply even refused to be military men proper anymore, at least to serve as such for the king, and they were now, as we have seen, lost, we could say, for even for the military service locally. And this is fascinating because Norway had, after all, less resources in that sense than the other kingdoms, and they had different history. At least the realization I have is that Norway had, after all, precocious, say, unitary monarchy, or at least a moment to which the Norwegian king could claim intermittently the control of essentially this coastal stripe, because that's what fundamentally Norway is. The interland is a freaking nightmare. So much, in fact, that even in there it seems the cavalry didn't develop very much, as we were saying before. And this is also important because there was properly the lack even of space for these aristocracies to emerge and to be co-opted by the king in a way. Sweden was a freaking mess from a political point of view, so that it was difficult to unify in the first place, but at least it had somewhat more resources. It was also closer to other lands of the Baltic. This increased the traffics, the distances weren't great. Denmark was the one that did the thing more orderly, favored by, as we've seen, politically by the proximity to continental Europe, to the even the land that in itself allows in this flatland to control in a way more easily, and being at the center of some major trade routes between the North and the Baltic Sea. So Norway, however, was the one that somewhat lagged behind, in as far as I understand, over time, at least in this process of feudalization that Norway, however, will undergo anyway over time. And in fact falling even under the influence of Denmark anyway, for that matter. And Denmark naturally also controls, the southern Scania, right? The southern part of Sweden. And Scania at some point, as far as I understand, when the Denmark has this moment after the end of the Viking year of kind of consolidate, a bit of a standstill because of internal consolidation, then it started suffering these attacks from the Danes, the Danish pirates. At some point we will have to make a video on them, and they start striking back. They even conquer, the Danes, the Danish even managed to conquer Rügen and to launch offensive, but as far as I understand, even the demands were required to the to the subjects, in Scania brought to rebellion, and that there is this long history of broader, think about the Kalmar Union in 14th century, Danish influence, interference, let's say, in geographical Sweden and also political Sweden, by the way, will last till the 17th century, and the whatever. This is just for saying how even the unity of these kingdoms was, especially one of Sweden, was very lately formed, and there was still at some point the Danish were even defeated by the 12th century, and this halted their expansion, but they could have actually carried out more in the Baltic. However, by this time, right, the 12th century especially, the influence of feudalism had begun to make itself felt in Scandinavia, right, to a limited extent for sure, but there are interesting changes. Consider that Scandinavian society, as we've seen, is not very stratified. There are these major landowners, then there's another class that essentially works for them, and that is still made up of freemen. Then there were the serfs under them, and therefore there are these local oligarchs that gradually are co-opted by the kings through this clienterly gift system, etc. And consider that there was no juridical system here in place before, right? The traditional Scandinavian legal system didn't contemplate the existence of a monarchy per se, right? So this was all this feudal net was built all very empirically, very on this very gradual relations of forces, gifts, interactions, and so on, and wars naturally. And during the 12th century, we start seeing properly what resembles the true kind of knightly, let's say, feudal society segmentation. We find the lendermen that are literally, or let's say in exchange, men were given land by the king, becoming fundamentally barons. Right here we have the realization that there is properly a feudal connection between the king and the land that is controlled by these people, not necessarily because the king had previously much more, of land on his own, right? Technically, they did give, we know in Denmark, for example, it's documented how this happened, but fundamentally it seems that it was mostly these individuals entering autonomously a bit like this for their own interest, fundamentally, as heads of few powerful families, right? Also in Norway, for example, we find this there were during the reign of Akon IV, 1217, 1263, there were only 9 lendermen, right? Which is interesting. This in part triggered interesting political institutional developments that will be felt positively in the modern age, where after all, the lack of proliferation of noblemen, like in continental Europe, for example, helped the monarchy to manage the picture, having this kind of designated barons. At some point, they even stopped nominating them, right? Following the reign of Hakon the Fifth, 1299, 1319. The barons were not nominated anymore, right? After 1308, those were the barons that would fundamentally remain, at least as I have understood. So you understand that this has nothing to do. I mean, look at, I don't know, Germany. That by that time was like there were hundreds and hundreds of noblemen of comparable status that did whatever they like, in spite of what the German king or Holy Roman Emperor said, and in the lower, so the lendermen would be what you imagine as probably the nobility, right? If you want the high nobility, because the nobility is a vague concept after all, can descend also below. And in fact, below the lendermen, there were the riddare, right? That is the knights, the riders, technically, right? And here, even the name, even the etymology tells you that. Like in German, you think about the Ritter, right? The Reiter, as the rider proper, that emphasizes more of a properly mounted character than a political social one that they naturally had, right? But it was less loaded with status, for example, than in other regions in Europe. Think about the German knights that up to fundamentally the end of the 13th century were juridically unfree, or what that's a German characteristic. But eventually in Scandinavia, this is even truer. Like as we've seen before, even for just availability of heavy mounts and just the knightly equipment, right? There were a few of these people, right? And it probably was a much larger number of kind of lighter horsemen that still, however, for Scandinavian standards, were formidable in that regard. And the riddare, or knights, had their own squires called svenner, right? And we know this actually from Norway, and similar developments took place in Sweden and Denmark. And speaking of Denmark, in here, the hird was introduced, as we said before, later, right? Only being established on the above lines by Svein Ulfsson, 1047-1076, in the mid 11th century, and it's also disappeared considerably earlier, right, ceasing to exist already by the late 12th century. And their members had probably transformed in the appearing knightly class of Denmark. And this new class of mounted warriors was created essentially by tax exemption grants in exchange for the military service, right? Assuming certain civil functions, as well as being permitted by law to hire the military service of other men, right? For example, there were limitations to this also for checking the rise. Instead of a too powerful aristocracy, the Norwegian lendermen were allowed retinues of as many as 40 men, right? Which is not an enormous much, but it's still the roof where you don't want to surpass, because already a force like that was mighty for Scandinavian standards. And yet the king could still allow higher retinues for whichever reason he was pleased with. Also considered that these magnates were powerful, very powerful, evidently, that they could challenge the king in a way, but still they were the most useful point of reference for royal policy, right, in order to cope with the communities of the king. And it was these knights who led also the local levy in wartime, right? So they were entrusted probably with the task of recruitment, right, through their own agents, their own, as we have seen in the Norwegian Hirdment, there were all these attendants with various, not just military, but also at least as aid roles, as even as spies, as as people who knew the populace, who knew the communities, and could organize the levy, generally speaking. Passing to Sweden, right, this tax exemption was introduced for all such men who served as armored horsemen or equipped another to do so. And this is interesting because from one side you see that there is the acknowledgement from royal authority that determines these allowances of the existence of people who already serve on a regular basis as as important class as armored horsemen, right? In which there are people who even pay for someone else to fight for in their stead, so that this means there is a higher monetization of service. There's something given in exchange. So this is not a context of a tribal context, which being a warrior is a duty and a privilege at the same time, because literally there are no other people who can do that for you because the resources do not allow it, right? So this is already an advanced stage that, in fact, is introduced in Sweden by the end of the 13th century in 1279 by King Magnus Barnlock, Magnus III, ruling between 1263 and 1280. In order to encourage, actually at that point, more men to become knights, right? Knighthood only then attaining some of the honor if it had enjoyed elsewhere in Europe for more than 2 centuries, but still enough for essentially giving, the king the power of investing the knights. And that was very important because it was a way of creating new clienteles among these people who could rise as new knights, because of the royal legitimization, and therefore entering is an entourage and military clientele and retinue. And as we will see now, essentially most of Scandinavian mailed horsemen, or armored horsemen, say better at this point, are fundamentally still within the retinue or a king or a lord in this kind of hird or feudal fashion. Right, so it's not that there are many more people out there, right, that are creating kind of this, a knightly status out of nothing. This still emerges naturally from the richest areas of Scandinavia, as we have seen in the hinterland, with the wild areas. Still, we find, a tribal context. The militias are very important. We actually made a video about Scandinavian militiamen that, illustrates a little better, the permanence of the continuity in the presence of this local militia of farmers, basically. I consider that the Scandinavia doesn't have even proper cities on their own. Like cities that start rising, especially along the coasts. Some were also joining the at least having ties with the Huns, and were actually mighty centers. Like they had their own internal fortresses. If they wanted, they could shut their gates to the king that didn't have an enormous deal, logistical resources and supplies to besiege them, for example. So, but they're not, there's not that intense urban phenomenon you find elsewhere, just even closer countries like Flanders, or even in northern Germany for what concerns especially the Hanseatic League. But definitely, as we've seen, at the outskirts of Scandinavia, there were even, still hunter-gatherers, right? And having actually a discrete importance, because still the Scandinavians were traveling far and wide. Consider, for example, the Swedish attempts to knock out the Novgorod, right, as this main important Russian trade center, the influence that gradually, all these Swedish colonists start having in Finland, living sometimes at the same level of the locals, of which they even get language that's what Finland today speaks, in fact, a Finnic language, and still being essentially a Western nation. And this is very important because it makes you understand the fluidity of the system, right, and how the rise of knighthood and military clienteles were all attached to the attempts of creating a more standard, more stable and central rule from essentially out of scratch, from countries that have never seen anything like that, right? If you look at Magnus the Third Graveslap, for example, that's typically imitating some of the highest, the royal models of all the other sovereigns in Western Europe, and even having an ideology, a political aim there to present himself as truly at the center, a true Swedish monarch, as meant to Sweden as a whole country. And there is another hint that confirms the, even the uncontrollability of this phenomenon, because in Sweden, the knighthood, this privilege became hereditary, right? Thus creating essentially a new nobility, as it would happen in Norway anyway. So that the hereditarization of the knightly status is evidently, like it happened, for example, in the late Carolingian phase. It's something that happens because de facto already exists, right? So in here it was not properly a Swedish king being heavily armored cavalryman maker. They didn't have the means to do anything like that. What they had the means was, a knightly confirmator, a knightly legitimator in a society that had already developed that kind of political and military culture that is going towards naturally the increase of this in power of these elites and over society. Always stressing naturally how this was not nearly as powerful as in the rest of Western Europe, right, where the feudal elite really controlled, especially by the 13th century, was at the apex of its power. In Scandinavia, it's still so. I can say half, if not, figuratively, but, with the local militias, with these other free communities that essentially want to deal with their business on their own, right, and often do, right, and not being there, after all, an enormous quantity of cavalry around, they can still, find a few knights and fight with them in open field and taking them down. This is very interesting because, there is properly a fringe of feudal of Europe where you can see how, in fact, as much as the feudal system does, it gets weaker, infantry is more powerful. Right, this was true in many ways. It's true in the Celtic fringe. It's true, in Germany up to the mid of the mid 12th century. I mean, in all those areas were still, even for other reasons, or even environmental. I mean, think about what Scandinavia could be in terms of in the 13th century in terms of habitability, like even the reclamation and bonification and the weather as well. That's the same reason why there weren't many resources in these countries after all, right? So this has to be very clear as a picture. And in general, we can say that on the whole, Scandinavian knights remain attached to, even just mentally and culturally, to the old idea of the retinue of a king or landed man, right? That's where they came from. They weren't an extraneous body to Scandinavian society. They literally emerged from within the same old structures that had made even the Viking era. Most of the nobility we see in the Scandinavian countries between the 11th and 13th century were actually the same, descending from the same landowners that were fueling the Viking invasions back in the day, right? They were the same families, the same clans, right? In many ways, having expanded their power and remaining the most powerful political and social element at a local level. And in terms of warfare, we'll have to see tactics, as you know, in another video. These videos are just about the army organization that we make for each of these people. All the tactic. The tactic video basically, but in general, just you have to picture most battles in Scandinavia in this century is being fought with no more than these retinues and a small number of locally levied militiamen, right? So a few hundreds of people on average, right? And therefore clashing in a dimension that, considering that the world, external influences, the local environment, etc., was very unique in its own way, right? And that we will analyze more accurately when we will make a video for each typology of fighter in this context, which we gradually make. And I think, all in all, we could stop here. There's all the lighting thing that is dramatically important, because that is still the very base of most of of military activities after all, because it's still basically the general levy of the kingdoms, especially the ones that are more exposed to essentially Norway. But also, as we've seen, Denmark expands by sea at this point, trying the Baltic to affirm its power. So still, there is a great continuity in the maritime, in the naval military traditions that had been of the Viking era, and as we were saying before, I mean, it would be participation even to the Crusades, lots of of faraway travels, right, in an area that is much more composite than it seems, right, in after all, in a longer perspective, because this, the Scandinavian action even exceeds Scandinavia still, right, by far. But anyway, we could talk about other aspects. For example, spread of crossbows among the Scandinavian militiamen. This is very important. That crossbows are fundamentally, and ideally at least, a kind of democratic weapon, because they knock down no matter whom, and they definitely contribute to increase the levels of protection of knights, their armor. And since Scandinavia has this still very active militias, well, these are, and they have to fight against knights and against each other. The crossbow spreads interestingly. I've noted that by the 14th century, Scandinavia has very interesting developments in armor. Think about the Visby finds. Think about the horrendous wounds caused by crossbow bolts that typically in that context show how even crossbow can shoot just much more parabolically and making bolts falling from the head. You find this heads pierced literally from on the top of the skull by crossbow bolts, and so that is actually important. It's, as we've seen, it's coupled even that context of Sweden, but important development, plate armor, and etc. But we will see that in the second part of the organization of Scandinavian armies between the 14th and 15th century. But the importance of the crossbow in Scandinavian society is rising steadily, right? Probably even in proportion more like than the advancement of, say, knightly class. I don't know how much this is true. Actually, there are many different traditions in Scandinavia in this sense. There are very primitive even types of weapons. Still, the material culture is very poor, and naturally, the more far away you go from the more economically active areas of the south, and the more you find these anachronisms. But, for example, the crossbows, having spread throughout all Scandinavia, became central, almost mystical, as it's showed, for example, in the Kalevala, that is Finland's national epic, where crossbow has kind of a magic role in there, and that's, for example, a context in which, as we have seen, there's not much of a spread of cavalry and knighthood. And in Finland, there is this more or less egalitarian living peasantry that still, however, for them, the crossbow was so important, right? And that's quite fascinating. And this is also for saying that I found certain authors that are also competent that say that Scandinavia didn't have much of this kind of arrogant and imposing figure of the knight, just in ethical terms. I actually disagree strongly, because it is true that knights hadn't that power practically, but the warlike mindset of these people that hadn't changed very much from tribal times actually contemplated still the idea of the hero, the idea of the single, the role of the individual in society, not necessarily just as the peaceful kind of zippe peasant, just even in this context where this society was less stratified, right? There was still a border between the warrior and the whatever you want to call it, in this sense the subject proper, like more than a farmer, because and there were these frontier areas, especially in the east, towards in Finland and Lapland, and what is today part also northern Russia, that were wild, like in every sense, and you find very different realities that sometimes make you literally go back in time of several centuries in this context. So Scandinavia is very fascinating in this regard, and I hope we will soon make videos that deal more in detail with these aspects. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.